Sometimes, a single night changes everything. For one Ohio father, the road home from work turned into the road to ruin. He thought he was just another tired parent trying to make it back safely to his kids. Instead, flashing lights, handcuffs, and headlines would brand him as something he never was. But what really happened that night? And why was the truth buried so deep? The November wind cut through the stillness of rural Ohio, carrying with it the promise of snow. Daniel Whitaker, a 42-year-old father of two, sat behind the wheel of his aging Ford sedan, fighting exhaustion. He had just finished a 14-hour shift at the auto plant. Overtime he couldn't refuse with Christmas around the corner. Bills were piling up, and his wife, Sarah, had reminded him just that morning about their daughter's school trip payment. Daniel's mind wandered between fatigue and responsibility, but his eyes stayed glued to the road. The highway was poorly lit, with patches of black ice shimmering faintly beneath the streetlights. He knew the stretch well, but tonight it felt more treacherous than usual. As he crossed into a darker bend of the road, everything happened in a heartbeat. A shadow moved, darted into the lane. Daniel's eyes widened. Adrenaline surged. He slammed the brakes, tires screeching on the icy pavement, but momentum carried him forward. Thud. The sound pierced the night. His car jolted. His chest tightened as if the world had collapsed inside him. Heart racing, Daniel swung open the door and stumbled out, breath fogging in the freezing air. That's when he saw him. A man in uniform, dark navy, no reflective vest, lying on the asphalt. A county deputy. Daniel's stomach twisted. Oh God. Oh no. Somebody help. He shouted into the emptiness. He knelt beside the man, trembling hands hovering, unsure whether to touch him or not. His training from old CPR classes blurred in his panic. All he could think about was the man's chest rising shallowly, faint signs of life. Relief tangled with terror. The wail of sirens tore through the night. Within minutes, patrol cars boxed in Daniel's vehicle, red and blue lights slicing the darkness. Deputies rushed out, some attending to their fallen colleague, others storming toward Daniel. Hands where we can see them, one shouted. Daniel froze, lifting his trembling hands. It was an accident. I swear. He stepped out, but before he could finish, they slammed him against the cold metal of his own car. The click of handcuffs echoed louder than the sirens in his ears. His chest pressed hard against the door, his cheek scraping the glass. Reckless driver, one deputy muttered. No, you don't understand, Daniel pleaded, voice cracking. I wasn't speeding. I hit the brakes. Check my car. The road, it's ice. Nobody listened. Nobody even looked at the icy patches glistening just feet away. Within moments, the narrative was written. A father driving home, reckless, maybe tired, maybe careless. Their colleague lay on the ground. Daniel was the man behind the wheel. To them, the story was simple. To Daniel, it was the start of a nightmare. As he sat in the back of the patrol car, steel biting into his wrists, Daniel's mind reeled. The face of his daughter, Emma, flashed in his thoughts, her science fair tomorrow. His son, Caleb, waiting for him to tuck him in. Sarah, who had kissed him goodbye with her usual gentle smile. Now all of that felt like a lifetime away. He tried to speak, to explain, but his words drowned under the weight of authority. Deputies exchanged clipped orders. Paramedics worked frantically over their fallen colleague. And Daniel, ordinary, hardworking, exhausted Daniel, was suddenly branded as the criminal of the night. No one cared that he hadn't been drinking. No one cared about the ice. No one asked why the deputy was standing in the middle of the road, in the dark, without reflective gear. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears as the patrol car door slammed shut, locking him inside. His world had turned upside down in less than 10 minutes. As the convoy pulled away, Daniel pressed his forehead against the glass, whispering to himself, "Please, just believe me. I didn't mean to. It wasn't my fault." But deep down, in that chilling moment, he realized something that made his blood run cold. No one wanted the truth. What hurts more than a mistake you couldn't prevent? For Daniel, it wasn't just the accident that shattered him. It was what came next. Sometimes the hardest blow doesn't come from fate, but from the people who are supposed to protect you. And that night in Ohio, justice seemed to vanish under flashing lights and raised voices. The patrol car rattled as it rolled through the small town streets. Daniel sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, shoulders slumped, the bitter sting of humiliation cutting deeper than the metal on his wrists. His head spun with disbelief. How had everything turned so fast? One minute he was on his way home, the next he was a criminal in the eyes of his own neighbors. When they pulled into the sheriff's station, Daniel's world grew even smaller. The harsh fluorescent lights glared down as deputies dragged him inside. No one asked if he was hurt. No one offered him water, though his throat was raw from shock. He tried again to explain, voice trembling. It was dark. The road was icy. He just stepped out. A deputy snapped back. Save it for the report. You'll have your chance. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't about explanations, it was about blame. Word spread quickly in their close-knit community. By the time Sarah arrived at the station, tears streaming, reporters had already gathered outside. Flashbulbs lit up her face as she tried to push through, calling his name. Daniel. Danny, are you okay? Inside, Daniel was fingerprinted, photographed, treated like every suspect who had ever passed through those walls. The camera's click burned in his memory. A mugshot, a symbol he never imagined would define him. When Sarah finally reached him, her voice cracked. They're saying you were speeding, that you didn't even brake. Daniel's chest tightened. That's not true. You know it's not true. I know, she whispered, clutching his cuffed hands. But they don't want to hear it. The sheriff's office issued a statement within hours, painting a clear picture. A local man struck a deputy with his vehicle late last night. Investigation pending. Possible reckless driving involved. On paper, Daniel was already guilty. By morning, the local news had his face plastered across screens. Father of 2 hits deputy in late-night incident. They never mentioned the icy road. They never mentioned the missing reflective vest. They never mentioned that Daniel had begged them to check his car's brake marks. Instead, they showed his mugshot, the tired, hollow eyes of a man who had already lost more than freedom. He had lost his reputation. At his kids' school, whispers turned to stares. Emma overheard classmates mutter. Her dad ran over a cop. Caleb came home with fists clenched after someone sneered. Your dad's a killer. Sarah shielded them as best she could. But every grocery trip, every walk to church, felt like walking through a trial without a jury. Strangers avoided her gaze, or worse, shook their heads in silent judgment. For Daniel, the humiliation cut deepest at home. Sitting at the kitchen table with his family, his hands shaking around a coffee mug, he felt stripped of dignity. I'm sorry, he told them, voice breaking. I never wanted this for you. But Sarah held his hand firmly. We know who you are, Danny. We know the truth. That's what matters. Still, the truth was fragile against the weight of an official badge. Weeks dragged on. Daniel was suspended from his job at the plant. His supervisor's voice had been apologetic but firm. We can't have the company's name tied to this in the news. Bills piled higher. Late notices filled the mailbox. His kids stopped inviting friends over. Their once lively home grew quieter, every room heavy with shame that wasn't theirs to carry. Daniel tried to hold on, but each day chipped away at his resolve. He wasn't just fighting accusations, he was fighting invisibility. His words, his innocence, seemed to vanish the moment they left his lips. The humiliation peaked when he was ordered to attend a community meeting about road safety. The irony was cruel. He sat in the back, head down, while speakers talked about reckless drivers and the need to protect law enforcement. People glanced over their shoulders at him, murmuring. That night, Sarah found him sitting alone on the porch, staring into the cold, dark sky. They'll never see me as anything but guilty, he whispered. She knelt beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. Then we'll fight. We'll fight until they do. For Daniel, hope flickered faintly in her words. But deep down, He wondered how long the truth could survive when drowned by humiliation, lies, and the power of authority. And little did he know, hidden evidence was already out there. Evidence that could change everything. But until then, Daniel was a prisoner of perception. Some wounds don't bleed. They spread quietly, through whispers, headlines, and the silence of people you once called friends. For Daniel, the accident was only the beginning. The real pain came after, when his family's world began to unravel under the crushing weight of suspicion and shame. Winter settled heavily over the small Ohio town, but for Daniel Whitaker and his family, the cold wasn't just outside. It seeped into their lives, into every corner of their home, into every glance from their neighbors. At first, Daniel thought people would understand. He believed once the investigation revealed the icy road, once they checked his car, once the truth came out, everything would go back to normal. But weeks passed, and instead of truth, there was silence. Instead of compassion, there were whispers. At the grocery store, Sarah pushed a cart while Emma trailed behind, clutching her mother's coat sleeve. Daniel stayed home that day, too humiliated to show his face. He knew what would happen, he'd already experienced it. The hushed conversations that suddenly stopped when he turned an aisle. The sideways glances. The muttered words like, "That's him." One neighbor he'd known for 10 years, a man who had borrowed his tools countless times, refused to meet his eyes. Another shook her head disapprovingly, as if Daniel had chosen this fate. Sarah forced a polite smile, but when they returned home, she sat at the kitchen table in silence, her hands trembling as she unpacked the bags. "They look at me like I'm married to a criminal," she whispered. Daniel placed a hand over hers. "You're not. You never will be." But deep down, he knew the community had already drawn its conclusion. For Emma, the fallout was crueler. She was only 12, sensitive and bright. Her life once filled with science fairs and school plays. Now she dreaded the hallways. She told her father one night, through tears, "They call me cop killer's kid. Dad, they don't sit with me at lunch anymore." Daniel's chest ached. He wanted to protect her, to shield her, but how could he protect her from something as invisible and poisonous as gossip? Caleb, just 9 years old, reacted differently. He grew angrier. He lashed out at classmates who teased him. One day, the school called Sarah to pick him up after he punched another boy. When Sarah asked him why, his small fists clenched at his sides. He said, "You should be in jail, Dad." I wasn't gonna let him say that. Daniel hugged his son tightly, tears burning in his eyes. "I'm proud of you for standing up, buddy, but we fight with truth, not fists. Okay?" Caleb nodded reluctantly, but Daniel could see the storm brewing inside him. The same storm that raged in Daniel's own heart. Financial strain only deepened the wounds. Daniel's suspension from the auto plant left them relying solely on Sarah's part-time job at a local bakery. Bills stacked up. Their savings drained quickly. Daniel even sold his beloved guitar, the one he'd played since college, just to cover the electric bill. Nights grew longer. Meals grew smaller. The once warm and lively family dinners turned into quiet affairs, broken only by Emma's sighs or Caleb's frustrated silence. And through it all, the sheriff's office remained unyielding. No updates, no acknowledgement, just the looming cloud of accusation. Daniel began to withdraw. He spent long hours on the porch, staring into the snowy fields. His mind replayed the accident over and over. The figure darting into the road, the screech of brakes, the thud that still haunted his sleep. Could I have stopped sooner? Was there something I missed? The questions gnawed at him. Even knowing the road was slick, even knowing the deputy hadn't worn reflective gear, guilt sank its claws deep. Sarah noticed the change. One night, she sat beside him, pulling a blanket over their shoulders. "You're disappearing, Danny. Don't let them take you from us, too." He swallowed hard. "I don't know how much more I can take, Sarah. Every day feels heavier than the last." Her eyes glistened, but her voice was firm. "Then let me carry it with you. We'll get through this." It was her strength that kept him standing, though barely. But the fallout wasn't just personal, it was public. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Local headlines painted him as the reckless driver who nearly killed a deputy. Few dared question the sheriff's narrative. And those who might have believed Daniel stayed silent, fearful of being seen as disrespectful to law enforcement. Daniel, once known as a dependable worker, a kind neighbor, a devoted father, was now reduced to a single label: the man who hit a cop. And as weeks turned to months, Daniel began to fear that truth might never surface, that he and his family would be trapped in this nightmare forever. But then, quietly, a new thread of hope began to weave itself into the story. A piece of evidence, overlooked by many, existed somewhere out there. A piece of evidence that could turn whispers into outrage and shame into vindication. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the storm that had torn his life apart was about to shift, and with it, everything he thought was lost. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, and sometimes those in power will do anything to keep it buried. For Daniel, the walls of lies seemed impenetrable, until one overlooked detail began to crack them open. What no one expected was that a single recording could turn the story upside down. By the 4th month after the accident, Daniel had grown numb to the rhythm of shame. Each morning was the same. Wake up, read headlines filled with half-truths, send his children to a school where they were whispered about, and sit at the kitchen table staring at unopened bills. The case against him remained strangely quiet. Deputies had taken his statement, collected his car, and filed their reports. But then, silence. To the public, silence meant guilt. To Daniel, silence meant something was being hidden. And he wasn't wrong. One afternoon, Daniel's attorney, a sharp but empathetic woman named Laura Jensen, called him into her office. Her eyes gleamed with something he hadn't seen in months: hope. "Daniel," she said carefully, sliding a file across her desk, "we may have found something." He leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "Dashcam footage from another patrol car on the scene that night. It wasn't included in the initial discovery file." Daniel's brow furrowed. "So, they hid it?" Laura nodded. "Or forgot. But someone in the records office slipped up. We pushed for every single piece of footage, and this one turned up." Hands trembling, Daniel watched as she opened a laptop. The video flickered to life. Headlights cutting through the dark, the icy stretch of road, and then the deputy. He wasn't standing safely on the shoulder. He wasn't even visible until the very last second. He stepped directly onto the blacktop, his figure barely illuminated, just seconds before Daniel's car came into frame. Daniel's throat tightened as he watched himself hit the brakes, the red glow of his taillights burning bright against the night. His desperate attempt to stop was clear, unmistakable. Laura froze the video. "This shows you did everything you could, Daniel." He walked into the lane with no reflective gear, no flashlight, nothing. "And you hit the brakes immediately. This isn't negligence. This is unavoidable." For the first time in months, Daniel felt a flicker of relief. His truth was right there, captured in pixels. But the relief was short-lived. Laura's tone darkened. "Here's the troubling part. The sheriff's office had this footage the entire time. And yet, they went ahead with statements framing you as reckless." Daniel sat back, stunned. "They knew? They knew I wasn't at fault." Her eyes held his. "It looks that way." The implications sank in like a stone. Not only had his life been destroyed by a tragic accident, but the very people sworn to uphold the truth had buried evidence to protect their own. The news of the dashcam leak spread quietly at first, shared among legal circles and a few online forums. But soon, journalists picked it up. The narrative began to shift. Headlines started asking questions instead of passing judgment. Was Ohio dad framed in deputy incident? And leaked dashcam raises new questions in controversial case. Neighbors who had once avoided Daniel now looked at him with uncertainty, some even with guilt. One stopped him outside the grocery store. "Danny, I didn't know. I'm sorry." But Daniel wasn't ready to forgive. Too much had been lost. His daughter's tears, his son's bruised knuckles, his wife's sleepless nights. None of that could be erased by a neighbor's apology. Laura pushed forward, filing motions, demanding accountability from the sheriff's office. Each hearing revealed more inconsistencies. Reports rewritten, witness statements altered, and above all, the glaring omission of the dashcam evidence. The community, once united in condemning Daniel, began to fracture. Some doubled down, insisting accidents like this still reflected poor driving. But others, fueled by outrage, demanded to know why their sheriff's office had hidden the truth. For Daniel, it was bittersweet. Vindication was close, but the scars of humiliation were permanent. He told Sarah one night, as they sat on the porch, "Even if they clear my name, nothing will ever be the same. Emma lost friends. Caleb lost his innocence. We lost years of peace. How do we get that back?" She squeezed his hand. "We don't, but we can make sure no one else goes through what we did." Those words planted a seed in Daniel's heart. This wasn't just about his own freedom anymore. It was about justice for himself, for his family, and for anyone else crushed under the weight of a cover-up. The dashcam footage was only the beginning, because soon the lawsuit would come, and with it, truths far darker than Daniel could ever have imagined. When truth finally surfaces, it doesn't just set you free. It demands a fight. For Daniel, the leaked dashcam footage wasn't just proof of his innocence. It was ammunition, and in a world where power had silenced him for too long, he was ready to use it. What started as a tragedy was about to become a $25 million battle for justice. The footage changed everything. For months, Daniel Whitaker had carried the weight of being branded a reckless father who nearly killed a deputy. Now, with a few minutes of grainy video, the story shifted. He wasn't a criminal. He was a victim of a system that had chosen lies over truth. Laura Jensen, his attorney, wasted no time. She filed a $25 million civil lawsuit against the sheriff's office, citing wrongful arrest, defamation, emotional distress, and malicious cover-up. The paperwork landed like a thunderclap, shaking the small Ohio county and rippling into national headlines. Ohio dad files $25 million lawsuit after evidence leak. Cover-up allegations rock local sheriff's office. For the first time, Daniel's name wasn't paired with shame. It was paired with courage. At the press conference, Laura stood beside him, her voice firm, each word carefully chosen. "My client, Daniel Whitaker, was humiliated, defamed, and nearly destroyed because those in power chose to bury evidence rather than face accountability. This lawsuit isn't just about money. It's about justice." Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Daniel, nervous but resolute, finally spoke publicly. His voice shook, but his words carried the weight of months of silence. "I'm not here to attack anyone. I'm here because my family suffered. My children were bullied. My wife cried herself to sleep. I lost my job, my name, my dignity. All while the truth sat in a drawer, hidden. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." The clip spread across news stations, social media, and talk shows. Strangers who had once condemned him now sent letters of support. Messages poured in from across the country. "Stay strong. We believe you. Fight this." But the sheriff's office didn't back down. In a carefully worded statement, they denied wrongdoing, insisting the omission of the dashcam footage was an administrative error. They painted Daniel's lawsuit as a money grab, an attempt to profit from a tragedy. Behind closed doors, though, tension was high. Deputies whispered, community leaders questioned, and in the courthouse, the legal battle began to take shape. Laura assembled a team of experts, accident reconstructionists, traffic safety specialists, and even former officers willing to testify about standard protocol. Each detail of the accident was dissected. The icy road, the lack of reflective gear, the timing of the deputy's step into the lane, the deliberate omission of key footage. Every piece strengthened Daniel's case. Meanwhile, the emotional toll weighed heavy on him. Lawsuits weren't quick, and they weren't kind. Depositions forced him to relive the accident again and again. Attorneys grilled him, trying to paint him as inattentive, tired, even careless. One opposing lawyer sneered during questioning, "Mr. Whitaker, isn't it true you've been working a 14-hour shift that day?" Isn't it possible you simply weren't paying attention? Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice steady. I was paying attention. The road was dangerous. He walked into the lane. I hit the brakes. I couldn't stop in time, but I tried. The footage proves that. Sarah sat behind him in every session, her presence a steady anchor. Emma and Caleb, too young to understand all the legal details, clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, their father's name would finally be cleared. The lawsuit also drew national debate. On one side, supporters praised Daniel for standing up against an institution that had wronged him. On the other, critics argued that lawsuits against law enforcement undermined respect for officers. Talk shows debated late into the night. Hashtags trended online. Daniel's life, once small and ordinary, had become a battleground in America's larger fight over accountability. But Daniel never lost sight of the personal stakes. To him, the lawsuit wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about looking his children in the eyes and proving he hadn't failed them. One evening, as he tucked Caleb into bed, his son whispered, "Dad, are you gonna win?" Daniel paused, his throat tight. "I don't know, buddy, but I promise I'll fight with everything I have." And fight he did. The courtroom battle loomed ahead, heavy with uncertainty. Every legal move carried risk. Every headline shaped public opinion. But with Laura's determination and the truth finally on their side, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time: strength. The lawsuit wasn't just a demand for money. It was a demand for accountability. A demand that the truth, once hidden, be seen by all. And as the trial date approached, Daniel braced himself for the hardest chapter yet. Because in court, lies don't whisper, they shout. And for the first time, he would face not just the sheriff's office, but a jury of his peers. What he didn't know, though, was that the biggest secret of all was still waiting to be uncovered. Truth doesn't always win easily. In a courtroom, it's not just facts that matter, it's who controls the story. For Daniel, the fight for justice was no longer just about what happened on that icy road. It was about whether a jury would believe him or the powerful voices determined to silence him. The courthouse stood like a fortress, its stone walls heavy with history and judgment. On the morning of the trial, Daniel Whitaker walked up the steps with his wife, Sarah, at his side. His hands trembled, but not from fear. This was the moment he had waited for. Months of humiliation, whispers, and hidden truths had led to this. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras poised to capture every detail. Supporters of law enforcement sat in clusters, their faces stern, while Daniel's small circle of family and friends gathered quietly in the back. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The trial began. The sheriff's office brought its best attorneys, polished and sharp, determined to dismantle Daniel's case. Their opening statement was a calculated attack. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," one lawyer said smoothly, "this case isn't about a man being silenced. It's about responsibility." Mr. Whitaker chose to drive after a 14-hour shift. He chose to operate a vehicle in conditions he knew were dangerous. And because of his choices, a deputy was left fighting for his life. Daniel's jaw clenched. To them, he wasn't a father, a husband, or a man caught in a tragedy. He was a villain. But then Laura rose, her presence calm but commanding. She spoke with the weight of truth on her side. "This case is about more than an accident," she told the jury. "It's about a cover-up. The sheriff's office had evidence that cleared my client, but instead of releasing it, they hid it. They allowed him to be branded reckless, careless, even dangerous, while his family suffered. This trial is not about excuses, it's about accountability." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The testimony began. Expert after expert testified for Daniel. An accident reconstructionist explained how the road conditions made it impossible to stop in time. A safety specialist described how deputies are required to wear reflective gear at night, gear that the injured deputy had not worn. Then came the dashcam footage. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered, and the jury watched in silence. The icy road shimmered. Daniel's headlights appeared. The deputy stepped into the lane. The screech of brakes, the red glow of taillights, the impact. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The truth was undeniable. Daniel had tried, desperately tried, to stop. Still, the sheriff's attorneys fought back. They grilled Daniel on the stand, their questions sharp as blades. You admit you were exhausted, correct? 14 hours on the job. Yes, Daniel answered, steady but weary. And exhaustion impairs reaction time, doesn't it? I was tired, but I was alert. I saw him. I hit the brakes. You can see it. And yet you still hit him. Daniel's voice cracked, but he held firm. Because it was impossible not to. He stepped into the road without warning. No one could have stopped in time. The opposing lawyer smirked, turning to the jury as if to say, see for yourselves. But Laura rose for redirect, her voice soft yet firm. Mr. Whitaker, if you hadn't hit the brakes, what would the footage show? Daniel met the jury's eyes. It would show nothing, but it shows my taillights, proof that I tried, proof that I cared. Silence filled the room. A father's words had cut deeper than any polished argument. Through the trial, Sarah sat steadfast, her eyes never leaving her husband. Emma and Caleb weren't allowed in court, but they waited each night at home, clinging to Sarah's updates. Did they listen today? Emma would ask. Do they believe Dad now? The trial stretched on for days. Witnesses contradicted each other. Old friends of the deputy testified to his character, while former officers whispered about the sheriff's office cutting corners. But underneath it all, a shadow loomed. Whispers of something darker began to surface. Rumors that the deputy hadn't just stepped onto the road by accident. Something was off. Something no one had said aloud yet. Laura sensed it. She leaned over to Daniel one evening as they reviewed notes. I think there's more, Danny. They're hiding more than just the footage. Daniel frowned. Exhaustion etched in every line of his face. More? What else could there be? Laura didn't answer. Not yet. But she was right. Because the biggest revelation, the one that would shake the courtroom and the entire town, was still to come. Sometimes the hardest truths aren't the ones we don't know. They're the ones hidden in plain sight. Daniel thought his battle was about proving an accident wasn't his fault. But in the courtroom, the real story unraveled, and what surfaced would shake not just his life, but an entire community's faith in justice. The trial had dragged on for 2 weeks. Every day Daniel walked into the courtroom, his heart heavy but his resolve unbroken. Sarah remained his anchor, while Laura, steady as steel, kept pressing for answers. Something didn't fit. The sheriff's office had fought too hard, concealed too much. On the 7th day of testimony, Laura called a surprise witness. A man in plain clothes walked nervously to the stand. His badge had been surrendered months earlier when he resigned from the force, but his conscience had never let him rest. State your name, Laura said gently. Former Deputy Richard Hayes. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel leaned forward. Hayes had once worked alongside the injured deputy. Mr. Hayes, Laura began, you reached out to my office last week. Can you tell the jury why? Hayes cleared his throat, sweat glistening on his forehead. Because I couldn't stay silent anymore. What happened that night wasn't what the sheriff's office told you. It wasn't even what Deputy Miller. He nodded toward the injured deputy seated stiffly at the prosecution table. Was told to say afterward. The courtroom tensed. Even the judge leaned forward. What do you mean? Laura pressed. Hayes took a deep breath. Deputy Miller wasn't supposed to be on that stretch of road. He wasn't responding to a call. He was conducting, let's just say, an unofficial check. And he was ordered not to wear reflective gear, because they wanted him to catch drivers off guard. Gasps erupted. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Objection! The sheriff's attorney shouted, but the judge silenced him. Go on, Laura urged. Hayes nodded. They were setting up a trap. The sheriff wanted proof that local residents were driving recklessly to justify new funding for patrol units. Miller was meant to step out and flag someone down suddenly, make it look like drivers weren't stopping. But that night, the wrong man came down the road. Daniel Whitaker wasn't reckless. He was careful. He hit the brakes. But the ice and the timing made it impossible to stop. And when Miller was struck, the plan backfired. Instead of admitting the setup, the sheriff's office buried it. They edited the footage, tried to pin everything on Daniel, and told Miller to keep quiet. The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors whispered. The judge banged her gavel for order. Daniel sat frozen. His mind reeled. This whole time, his name dragged through the mud, his family suffering. It hadn't been just negligence. It had been a deliberate trap. The sheriff's attorney sputtered, trying to discredit Hayes, but Laura was ready. She produced documents Hayes had smuggled out before resigning, emails, memos, even a training note about visibility reduction strategies. It was undeniable. The jury's faces hardened. Some looked outraged, others sickened. And then came the twist Daniel never expected. When Deputy Miller himself took the stand, his voice broke. "I never wanted any of this," he said, eyes glistening. "I was following orders. I begged them to let me wear the vest. I said it wasn't safe. They told me to trust the plan. And when the accident happened, they told me I had to blame you, Mr. Whitaker, or lose everything." Daniel's breath caught in his chest. The man he thought was his enemy, the man he believed hated him, was crying as he spoke. "I'm sorry," Miller whispered, looking at Daniel. "I didn't mean for your family to suffer." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of truth pressing down on every soul inside. By the time closing arguments came, the sheriff's case was in ruins. Laura's words thundered through the courtroom. "This wasn't an accident turned tragedy. It was a cover-up, and it cost my client nearly everything." When the jury returned, the verdict was swift. Daniel had won. The $25 million judgment wasn't just a number, it was vindication. But as Daniel stood outside the courthouse with Sarah's hand in his, the cameras flashing, he felt something deeper than victory. It wasn't money that mattered. It was the truth finally being known. For months, he had carried the shame of being branded careless. Now the world knew the reality. He was not the villain. He was the man who refused to be crushed by lies. Reporters shouted questions. Supporters clapped him on the back. His kids would finally hear the words they longed for. Your dad told the truth, and the truth won. And yet, as Daniel looked back at the courthouse doors, where Deputy Miller lingered with his head bowed, he realized something else. In the end, both of them had been victims, one of circumstance, the other of a system that valued power over honesty. It wasn't just a shocking twist. It was a warning, because if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone.